when we were talking about Mendelian genetics, we talked about linked traits. So if we have traits that are not linked, they occur on different chromosomes, and traits that are linked occur on the same chromosome. The sex chromosomes contain protein coding genes, and they also contain the sex determination. So let's look at our X chromosome. Our X chromosome has somewhere in the neighborhood of 900 to 1,000 protein coding genes, whereas the Y chromosomes contain much less information. They only have about 100 genes on them. So if our X chromosome has this much genetic material, then our Y chromosome has very short genetic material. So if we're talking about a gene that would occur at this location on the X chromosome, there's no homolog for that allele, right? So males are functionally haploid for all of this rest of the genes that would occur on the X chromosome. There's no homolog for them. So if there's a recessive trait, let's call this little r, there's no possibility to have a big R on the Y chromosome because that part of the chromosome doesn't exist. So in this case, their genotype, which is just little r, is also going to be their phenotype. They're going to express the recessive trait. So some X-linked traits is red-green color blindness. We have male pattern baldness. There's even some evidence that left-handedness is a X-linked traits. We see a recessive allele show up more common in biological males than biological females. A classic example of an X-linked trait that occurs on the X chromosome is the trait for hemophilia. So what we might have is our blood vessel, if there's a tear in a blood vessel, right? So some reason that gets damaged, you fall down, you scrape your knee, for example. There's going to be the expression of proteins that are going to act as a little net. And these other proteins called platelets are going to get caught in that net. And you're going to have a scab form and stop the bleeding. So that's our normal blood vessel. Okay. In a hemophilic blood vessel, there's no ability to create that net. And so this minor scrape can lead to significant amounts of blood loss because of those proteins that don't function as they should. Okay, so we're interested in what is the inheritance of these sex-linked traits? And let's just kind of go back and look again at our dihybrid crosses, because remember, dihybrid crosses is where we're looking at two traits. So the classic thing that we talked about back with Mendel was our two traits of seed shape, of being either round or wrinkled, and seed color, being either yellow or green. So we had to have this big 16 square Punnett square in order to get all the combinations. This really complicated dihybrid cross. In fact, they were so complicated that I didn't even make you do them in the homework assignment. Now, when we're talking about a sex-linked trait, we're still keeping track of two traits. We're keeping track of biological sex and right, whatever the trait is. So let's go with hemophilia. We need to keep track of two things, but how are we going to do that with our 4x4 Punnett square that we see here? Well, we only need a 4x4 square because this biological sex is determined by the chromosomes. Okay? So here's our biological father with an X chromosome and a Y chromosome. Here's biological mom with an X and a chromosome and an X chromosome. Okay, and we can sort out the alleles that mom has, big B and little b, by just having this extra piece of information being shown up here. Okay, what we do not see is this Y chromosome does not get a big B or a little b, because when we remember when we were looking at the X chromosome that had this really long pieces of information, the Y chromosome had little short pieces of information. The B's don't occur on the Y chromosome. Okay. So this is how we're going to do our sex-linked trait Punnett squares. So let's kind of get some vocabulary out of the way. Okay, so first let's talk about what we mean by a carrier. Okay, a carrier is always going to be a biological female. And we know the genotype of the carrier. We know the sex chromosomes. Let's use H's for this one, for hemophilia. Okay. Now, if mom had the disease, we know that she would have 2 recessive alleles. We would know, if she was not a carrier, we would know that she was 2 dominant alleles. So as a carrier, she's going to be heterozygous for the hemophilia trait here, because she is carrying the recessive allele, but her dominant allele is preventing the recessive allele from being expressed. So now we got dad is not hemophilic, so we know that this is a biological male. What we do know is the genotype for the sex chromosomes. Do we know the genotype for the hemophilic trait? Well, if he's not hemophilic, he has to have the dominant allele on the X chromosome. What kind of allele does he have on the Y chromosome? Trick question, no alleles. So let's look at how we're going to produce our male gametes. Dad can produce a X chromosome that has the dominant allele for hemophilic, or he can create a Y gamete. Okay. Mom can create an X chromosome that has the dominant allele for hemophilia, or she can create an X chromosome with the recessive allele. So then, well, all we're going to do is fill in this. Okay. Now we can compare and get some questions about the phenotype of the potential offspring for this cross. So now that we have this filled in, we can ask these questions. What is the probability that this cross is going to result in a daughter that has hemophilia? So what we're going to do is that we are going to look at the daughters, right, the biological females that have 2 X chromosomes, and see if there's recessive traits on both X chromosomes. Well, this is dominant, this is dominant, this is dominant, this is recessive. So there's a 0% chance that this couple is going to produce an offspring that is biologically female with hemophilia. Now, the probability that this couple will have a biological male offspring that is hemophilic is, okay, well, let's find out. So we have a X chromosome with a dominant allele. So this is a biological male without the disease. Here's our X chromosome with the hemophilic allele. And here's our Y chromosome. So we are going to have a 50% chance that a biological male will have the disease. Now, what if I asked a different question that's not up here? What's the probability that any offspring of this cross is going to have hemophilia? Well, normal, right? Not expressed. There's a 25% probability that any of the offspring are going to have hemophilia. So while we're looking at this, let's figure out, where does this hemophilia come from? Does it come from the dad or does it come from the mom? This X chromosome has to come from the mom. Because in order to be a son, you have to get your Y chromosome from your father. Moms can't give Y chromosomes. Moms can only give X chromosomes. For there to be a biologically male offspring, the X chromosome must come from the mom. So if you want to know if you are going to have male pattern baldness, don't look at your dad's dad, look at your mom's dad, because that's where you're getting those traits from. Now, let's not get this confused then. This Y chromosome is directly inherited through the paternal line. Only dads can give Y chromosomes.